Why you are unimpressed with natural theology? Hey, I totally understand. The current state of natural theology in many ways is actually very unimpressive. You've heard the many arguments so many times, the kalam, the moral, the fine tuning, right? Consciousness. We've heard all these things. Foundations of moral values and duties for them to be objective, right? The beginning nature of the past rather than a beginningless nature of the past, all those kinds of arguments. What I'm going to be going over for you guys today is a more nuanced approach that is actually well established in the philosophy of science and actually in the philosophy of religion as a whole. And that's what I'm going to take you guys through, give you a little introduction into that. It's Tim from Invoking Theism, representing doxastic mastery. If you want to master your beliefs, you master your worldview. I'll see you in there. Okay, so now we are at the flowchart, the diagram, the presentation, and I'm going to be taking you guys through what is called an inductive natural theology. And so a big part of what I'm doing is I'm actually giving you guys what I almost call the Swinburnian gospel. Don't get too hung up on that. But basically the philosopher Richard Swinburne. Richard Swinburne has done something pretty incredible and something that I think is the right approach, especially if you have more so of a dabbling, at least a requisite understanding of epistemology. Inductive natural theology is what we can call this. And what's beautiful about this is a great way and just a great name, a great label for what we want to call this. And we're going to go through in this entire presentation exactly why this matters and then how this actually has many advantages in terms of building out a case for theism, or at least showing the reasonableness of theism, invoking theism. Hence, I'm going to have some skin in the game when it comes to what we're doing here. So we have an article by Richard Swinburne. It's actually called The Existence of God. It came out in 2020. It was actually something that I was, as I was doing research and scouring the internet, I came across this. And it's actually a beautiful paper because it balances very well the accessibility of these concepts as well as a straightforward, without sacrificing rigor, approach to natural theology. And so we have to understand exactly the kind of natural theology we're working here. What is the definition and what are the purposes of natural theology? Natural theology is the practice of providing arguments for the existence of God based on observable phenomena without relying on divine intervention. And so with anything that we explore and we inquire into reality, it starts off with us being a conscious observer. We are sensory agents and we bring in experiences, and there's going to be perceptual and these are going to be felt. And then we make judgments based on those experiences. And these judgments can actually be related to divine implications. And the purpose is to show the existence of God makes sense of various aspects of such experiences of our universe better than any other explanation. And so I think that this has a big advantage over deductive arguments, right? Because the thing with deductive arguments is that the goal is to provide certainty, right? And Swinburne argues, I think very rightly, that that's not suitable for coming up with a God hypothesis. Why? Well, because no one can conclusively show that a contradiction results when you have two propositions: there is a universe and there is no God, right? Of the form P and not P, as we understand, A and not A. So what inductive arguments do is they rather rely on probability judgments, right? Certainty, you could say, is a probability of 1, and you could say that anything between 1 and 0, which is a degreed, kind of what we call a degree theoretic approach, is actually going to be more appropriate for arguing for God's existence, right? Especially with that kind of a kind of being with a kind of nature that is not at all something that we can actually detect using any of our mechanisms or apparatuses. It's going to be very much metaphysical in nature. It doesn't really concern the actual being of God qua being. It's actually going to really concern God's existence in terms of just the hypothesis and the properties and the content of the hypothesis itself. So this is very much just an epistemic approach. So throughout this article, Swinburne goes through and makes a bunch of distinctions and delineations between relevant concepts. And one of these relevant concepts is a criteria for good inductive arguments. Now, his inductive criteria, right, or you can call it its explanatory criteria, are the conditions that need to be satisfied whenever you're going to be looking at what your explanatory target is. And so let's go ahead and let's keep on with exactly what this criteria is. There's 4 total, and you have expected phenomena, unlikeliness otherwise, simplicity, and background knowledge. What exactly are these criterion? What are the conditions here that need to be satisfied? Well, expected phenomena. You can think of expected phenomena as being like predictive power or explanatory power. These things can be used interchangeably. And expected phenomena, that's the idea that, hey, does the hypothesis that we're working with, right, does it demystify the event that occurred, the state of affairs, the data, right? Does it treat it as, oh, this is just will be a matter of course, or, oh, yes, I would not be surprised if this were to occur if I know this hypothesis is true. Is it to be expectable? Do I have a high confidence or believability that if this hypothesis is true, then this data is unsurprising? Unlikeliness otherwise, right? So if you have the negation of the hypothesis, does it end up rendering the data mysterious? Does it seem like there's something lacking? There's something left over that needs to be solved or at least addressed, right? The unlikeliness otherwise. And then the simplicity, right? And simplicity here, we've heard of Occam's razor, principles of parsimony and simplicity. This is the idea that when you're positing an explanation, you want to posit an explanation, especially because we're going to be doing more of a comparative analysis. You want to posit an explanation that's going to posit the fewest amount of properties, the fewest amount of relations, fewest quantity, and fewest ideological terms, right? Fewer undefined terms, things like that. And so it's this balance and this trade-off between what we can call a qualitative parsimony or we can call it quantitative parsimony. And that simplicity should be measured to the same degree. It should correlate and correspond to the same degree as the phenomena that you are attempting to explain. Someone actually put it in one of his interviews, I think on Closer to the Truth, that you should actually not posit too much to explain too little. And so Nevin Klimenhaga, he is a philosopher of probability and philosopher of science working in philosophy of religion, working at Australian Catholic University. He puts in his the structure epistemic probabilities paper that the simplicity of a theory should be measured on the same level as its explanation. So the explanation that you are giving, right, it's only then when you have an explanation take into account all the theoretical virtues and constraints satisfied that within those constraints you then work on the simplicity. And then lastly, you have background knowledge, meaning, hey, whatever explanation we're positing, right, it shouldn't contradict other theories that are well established in neighboring fields, so it should mesh with those. And so moving down the flow here, we just have a more quick and dirty run through of these. Expected phenomena. Evidence cited must be expected that the hypothesis God's existence is true. Unlikeliness otherwise, the evidence must be unlikely to occur if the hypothesis is false. Simplicity, the hypothesis must be simple, involving a few more serious assumptions and entities. I went through and kind of expanded exactly what those assumptions and entities mean. And then background knowledge, the hypothesis fit well with our broader knowledge of the world, and I explained that it shouldn't negate at least what has been well established in neighboring fields, or at least our best theories. And so moving along with that is we have our explanatory targets that Swinburne actually goes over in this paper. And we have a universe, laws of nature, and the evolution of life. These are very interesting targets, right? Because they're broad enough. And I would even say that they are, I would say, global preconditions for pretty much anything that has unfolded, on the giant causal nexus that is really the cosmos. These 3 data points, this data set here, you could say, cumulatively is a precondition for really any of the non-fundamental states of affairs that would actually occur. Well, what is the universe, right? Well, we could call this physical stuff, right? That there exists a succession of states of affairs in that we ascribe to have physical properties, right? And so the universe, right, is this manifold, this expanding manifold of these states of affairs that successionally, that follow succession in a causal frame. And then you have the laws of nature. And these laws of nature, that's going to be the orderliness of the universe, right? So it's not that there's a universe, but it's also that it's not a chaotic mess, and that there's predictability, right? Described by simple natural laws, as Schwimmer likes to put it. And then you have the evolution of life, right? That eventually the biosphere that we understand today exists, but not only the biosphere, but actual agents such as embodied moral agents like myself that form these moral communities. And so these are global preconditions, I would say. But before we get into how we're going to examine those explanatory targets, we have what we call a personal explanation, and then what we call a scientific explanation. And Swinburne, if you read any of his work, The Existence of God, Is There a God?, other articles that Swinburne has done throughout his entire multi-decade history of teaching, he goes through these two types of explanations. And so what I did is I pulled actual excerpts of these explanations that he gives from the paper here, so that you have direct quotes and you're not just doing a trust me bro process in taking what I'm saying off on face value. So, personal explanation. What is personal explanation? He says, however, there's a kind of explanation of phenomena which we use all the time, and this is a proper way of explaining phenomena. This is what I should call personal explanation. We often explain some phenomenon E as brought about by a person P in order to achieve our purpose or goal G. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The present motion of my lips is explained or brought about by me for the purpose of delivering a lecture. The cup being on the table is explained by a person having put it there for the purpose of drinking out of it. Yet this is a different way of explaining things from the scientific. Scientific explanation involves laws of nature and previous states of affairs. Personal explanation involves persons and purposes. If we cannot give a scientific explanation of the existence of the orderliness of the universe, perhaps we can give a personal explanation. And that is the kind of explanation theism is. And this is where Swinburne really gets the thrust of his case. And then we have our scientific explanation here. My next phenomena is the operation of the most general laws of nature. That is, the orderliness of nature is conforming to very general laws of physics, from which the regularities of chemistry and biology follow. What exactly the most general laws? Our science may not have been discovered. Perhaps the field equations of Einstein's general relativity are more likely. There are some yet more fundamental laws. Perhaps the laws are a theory of everything. Now, science can explain why one law operates in some narrow area. Think about that as there's some region of space-time with a hierarchical arrangement of, as you get lower, you have lower levels of non-fundamentality, right? This narrow area that relies on already pre-existing properties and states and powers of the world, right? For whatever phenomena or events are taking place to actually have their instantiation. This is exactly what he's talking about. So you have like these narrow areas in terms of the operation of a wider law in particular conditions. So these are going to be the conditions that set up the boundary, the terms and conditions for the game, you could say, just in the sense that if you're going to play chess, there are already pre-existing terms and conditions for what you can do, what degrees of freedom you have when you play the game. Thus, it can explain why Galileo's law of fall holds, that small objects near the surface of the earth fall with a constant acceleration towards the earth. Galileo's laws follow from Newton's laws, given that the earth is a massive body far from massive bodies, and the objects on its surface are close to the small in mass in comparison. But what science, by its very nature, cannot explain is why the most general laws of nature that there are for X hypothesis, no wider laws that can explain their operation. That there is a universe and that there are laws of nature are phenomena so general and pervasive, talk about this global precondition language I keep using, that we just tend to ignore them, right? But there might so easily not have been a universe at all, ever. Or the universe might have been so easily have been a chaotic mess. Very true. left to chance, apply the principle of indifference, there's nothing telling us that this way in which the universe exists should be biased or selected over any other way the universe should exist. That there is an orderly universe is something very striking, exactly, given the principle of indifference. That's kind of just implied and baked into what Swinburne is saying here. Such a G that he doesn't really go into it. Yet beyond the capacity of science forever to explain, science's inability to explain these things is not a temporary phenomenon caused by the backwardness of 21st century science. Rather, because of what a scientific explanation is, these things will ever be beyond its capacity to explain. For scientific explanations by their very nature terminate with some ultimate natural law. Let's read that again. For scientific explanations by their very nature terminate with some ultimate natural law and ultimate arrangement of physical things. And the questions I am raising are, why are there natural laws and physical things at all? And so if you think about the deficit of a scientific explanation being the exhaustive or being a sufficient explanation, not lacking in anything, you can see where the problem is because once you get far back enough, right? We talk about how in quantum theory, we need a quantum theory of gravity to actually be able to have the mathematics to evaluate the earliest stages of the universe's pre-inflationary era prior to what we know the Big Bang to be. If there is a discovery of some more general, more global natural law that governs the inflationary periods or inflationary phenomena, right? Any scientific explanation is going to have to appeal in the most reductionist form possible to that natural law. But the issue about that is that that natural law and the conditions that set up physical things to move and have their being cannot be explained by the very nature of scientific explanation, because then it would become viciously circular. You would end up explaining, if A explains B, then and B explains A, then A explains B, you actually never get an explanation. It becomes a viciously circular, and this is something you can avoid. It defeats itself. It presents itself on its own undercutting defeater, right? And that's going to be the problem. And so he sets up this framework where, hey, listen, the probability is very low that this is going to be the case if it was just given a scientific explanation, given what scientific explanation relies on to actually garner an explanation. What about personal explanations, right? What about agents with intentions and beliefs and the powers to act based on those intentions and beliefs, right? I mean, we even form them. And so if we move down the line, and we're doing pretty good, if we move down the line, then we go into this larger cumulative case. Well, what is the kind of being or God that Swinburne posits? Now, if you take this right here, this is not actually something taken from Swinburne. This is actually something I find helpful, taken from Joshua C. Jawadi, which, if you know anything about him, he's like Swinburne 2.0. But what he's done is he talks about how God right here, he sets up a biconditional arrow. That if we talk about God here in the circle, then if we say, hey, God exists, it is true that God exists, then this name here, God, is true if and only if an omnipotence module trope exists. And an omnipotent module trope exists if and only if God exists. They are logically equivalent. And the interesting thing about this is Swinburne has his own way of getting the properties of God handled. And what I really like about this method here is that God is just identical to a power. Everything that moves and has its being according to a power's theoretic understanding of the world and reality is that you start with power, and then everything proceeds, and there's varieties of powers. Well, if we start with the simplest kind of power, it's going to be a power with zero limitations. And so we're going to start with some capacity. There's going to be power with degrees. And as you go up the spectrum of degrees of powers, as you move along that spectrum, especially when you get to higher degrees of power, you're going to be able to actually demarcate different kinds of powers, right? And different kinds of powers result just as a byproduct. It's just a consequence, or at least. And so in this situation, if God is understood as being power with zero limitation, Well, then we have the fewest assumptions about the degree of powers that God has, 0. And 0 is simpler than 1 or infinity. But the interesting about that is when you have 0 limitations on power, then you get these different characteristics, right? And of course, Sijawadi characterizes this powers-based approach situated within a trope theoretic understanding. And this trope theoretic understanding has God being an object, but also being self-exemplifying because it's a modular trope and maximally thin. And that's the kind of character that it has. And so then you have the power insofar as to actually bring about a universe, like an orderly universe, but the power to have the knowledge to bring about an orderly universe, the power to actually know all truths and all concepts, right? The power to be free. All these different things come when you have 0 limitations on powers. And so moving down the line, these are the different arguments. And what I did is I wanted to make it as simple as possible with a few bullet points before getting into the larger scope of things. And Swinburne does something beautiful, which is he doesn't do a premise by premise, which is exactly why you should be adopting this wider system. This is something that I really want to hark on, which is that a lot of the classical apologetic arguments, at least the ones that are actually further more discussed in the academic literature and philosophy of religion, oftentimes dialectically speaking, those things don't help. So here's a good way to put, if you put it in bullet point form. We have the argument for the existence of the universe, an orderly complex universe, and the evolution of life. For the existence of the universe, we have our phenomenon. We always have to start with our phenomenon, and we have to give the limitation of what a scientific explanation can do. The very existence of physical universe, and the limitation is science can't explain. It can explain how different states of affairs fall from one to another, but it cannot explain why there's a universe at all, because you need a universe for there to be a scientific explanation. It's something that just is outside of its scope. And so the inductive argument here is that the existence of a universe is more probable if there's a God who created it than it just rose about by chance. Remember, applying that principle of difference across the board. Then we have an argument from an orderly complex universe. What's the phenomenon here? The orderliness and consistency of the laws of nature. And so what is the scientific explanation here? Well, science can describe the laws of nature, but it cannot explain why such orderly laws exist. And so we could have different laws, except we have these simple orderly laws that give rise to widespread order in the universe, which is a precondition and requisite for any kind of discovery in ethic and moral decision making, right? And that's a whole thing on its own. So the inductive argument here is that the existence of such orderly laws is more probable if there is a God who established them than they are the result of random processes. And so if you have indiscriminate selection pressures and then they bring about laws, right? Well, there's a multiplicity of ways that you can have very complex laws and laws that do not actually promote widespread predictability that actually do end up affecting value domains like the ethic and moral domains. You can throw a static in there if you want. And last, we have the argument from the evolution of life, right? So what is the phenomenon here? It's the evolution of animals and humans, right? And obviously that's going to be a biological theory. And so we understand that there are certain theories of organismal change that help us understand that. But the fact that there's organismal change in the first place is very interesting, especially because it's led to a wide diversity of kinds of creatures. And so what is the scientific account? Well, it's going to be, an account of organismal change, which is going to be obviously Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection as it was first published. We've come a very long way today, needless to say. And the diversity of life, but it does not explain why the conditions for evolution exist, right? I mean, what does that really mean? Well, the conditions for evolution to exist is a lot of people make this mistake where they think that it doesn't matter what the environment's like. Evolution is like this thing that is in the ether that supervenes on the physical environment and then adapts accordingly. But actually, to get any kind of adaptations, to get any kind of stable or metabolic and self-replicating entities like the kind that are organisms, yeah, evolution is just it's an uninteresting byproduct when you have that kind of self-replication. But for that to happen, you need conditions, right? You need boundary conditions that set up the constraints so that this does happen, right? Evolution isn't this unrestricted process, where it just can happen. There are constraints on constraints on constraints, hierarchically arranged, such that there are layers of fundamentality that actually really do dictate what can and cannot evolve. And so the fact that those conditions exist is very interesting. And so we have a kind of a fine tuning here, where the initial conditions, laws of nature, and the constants are take on values such that it gives you a life permitting range where the eventual evolution can happen. And so the inductive argument here is that the fine tuning of the universe for life is more probable if there is a God who intended for life to evolve rather than happen by chance. Remember, the personal explanation just implies intentions. And so it makes sense that God is that kind of agent, especially since it's the simplest explanation. And moving to our last part right here, we have what I can call a combined argument, where we can combine all of these things together. And so we have a list of premises, and then we have a conclusion, and then we have a formalized structure. Well, what are the premises here? Well, we have a total of 6. And so we have U being the universe exists, right? And we have L, that there are consistent orderly laws of nature, right? And so our E is that life is evolved and fine-tuned universe. That's going to be our evidence, our data. So 4, the probability here of the universe existing, given that God exists, is greater than the probability of a universe existing than if God does not exist. So the existence of the universe more likely if there is a God is what this ends up coming down to. Well, the probability of there being orderly laws of nature given God is greater than orderly laws of nature given not God. So the existence of orderly laws is more likely if there is a God. And then 6, we have the life is evolved in a fine-tuned universe, so the probability of that given God is greater than the probability of life evolving in a fine-tuned universe given that God does not exist. So the fine-tuning and evolution of life is more likely than there is if there is a God. So our conclusion here is going to be the fact that, therefore, the existence of the universe, laws of nature, and fine-tuning for life collectively make the existence of God highly probable. This is a cumulative approach, right? I mean, each of these data points, they don't have to raise the probability of theism to a very high degree, but you can have small degrees of support. But when you get enough of them and their diversity and put them together, you can get very, very, very high exponential degrees of support. And so formalized, right? Premise 1, U, premise 2, L, premise 3, E, and then the probability of the universe existing given God's existence is greater than the universe existing given not God's existence. The existence of laws of nature given that God exists is greater than laws of nature given that God does not exist. And the probability of there being life in a fine-tuned universe given that God exists is greater than the existence of life in a fine-tuned universe if God does not exist. So then the only conclusion is that God is more probable given the data of the universe, the conjunction of the laws of nature, and the conjunction of the life evolving in a fine-tuned universe. And that's really his approach. And this is the beauty about the the inductive natural theology here, is because these are very, very modest points, but you're actually able to live a powerful argument here, right? Because you always believe in what's most probable. This is the whole point. All of our scientific theories and really any kind of explanation you're going to come about when you're doing your day-to-day just pragmatically, you're going to be making probability judgments. Your judgments are going to come in degrees. And so in the same way, the hypothesis concerning God or concerning that there isn't a God is going to do the same thing. There's many advantages here. And so your premises can be modest and doesn't have to be as strong as the deductive version. And then you can actually approach this in various in a duplicated way that you do in science. The logic of science is actually found here. And so if you trust our greatest scientific theories, then you should trust the same methodology that can use to argue that God exists. I don't know why you wouldn't do anything else. And we have our conclusion. And our conclusion here is that, well, the cumulative case is obviously the superior, right? And the effects of these inductive arguments make the existence of God highly probable, right? It's going to be more probable than its rival theories. And so the role of inductive arguments is that they provide substantial evidence for God's existence. The notion of evidence is the notion of justification and explanation we use in every field of inquiry. And so we should be using the same and when it comes to establishing the existence of hypotheses, or at least the truth of hypotheses, because we shouldn't discriminate, or we should at least have a good reason for not doing so, or for doing so. And so that's the whole process, right? And I think that it is going to be paradigm shifting and changing if you allow yourself to really familiarize yourself with the work of people like Swinburne and other theologians and philosophers and atheologians and philosophers that actually use a similar approach, even if it's on the opposite side or on the same side. Agnostics are welcome too, to actually be able to dive into this and understand it. If you want a mastered way to actually establish this and be able to have a unified framework that can actually address and interact with any data, right? There's a lot of help here, and that's what I'm here to do. And so if you look in the description and look in the comments, you're going to see a link. Go ahead and fill out that form. I can help you out. I can get the certainty of implementation done in this way. If you are a seeker, if you're somebody who is a theist already looking to increase at least their competency, or someone who isn't at all, you at least want to know the best frameworks here. We're here to master our beliefs because we want a mastery over our worldview. Master your beliefs, master your worldview, like I always say. Anyways, that's everything. Thank you for your